In late October of 1944, the Empire of Japan was in a dire situation. The Second World War had turned decisively against the Japanese, and their navy's aviation arm was essentially destroyed during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Now, the Allies were preparing to assault the Philippines while also advancing in Burma. In response, the Imperial Japanese Navy sailed out with the last of its combined strength for an all-out offensive that culminated in the Battle of the Leyte Gulf. In this video, we will discuss Japan's strategic situation in the autumn of 1944 and how the Japanese Naval High Command planned to turn the tide of the Pacific War. We begin in the aftermath of the Battle of the Philippine Sea from the 19th to the 20th of June 1944. The battle, a reaction to the Allied invasion of the Mariana Islands, was a catastrophe which changed Japan's strategic outlook for the rest of the Second World War. In 2 days of combat, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost 3 precious aircraft carriers and 450 aircraft. Although most of the IJN's carriers survived the battle, hundreds of irreplaceable trained pilots were lost. Furthermore, the defeat sealed the fate of the Marianas, which were a vital Japanese stronghold in the Central Pacific. 15,000 key naval personnel such as mechanics, ship engineers and intelligence staffers were also trapped on the islands. Most importantly, the loss of the Marianas would give the United States a base to launch a strategic bombing campaign against the Japanese home islands. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Staff publicly announced a great victory over the Americans at the Philippine Sea. Propagandists made absurd claims that Japanese pilots had sunk 9 aircraft carriers and 5 battleships. In reality, only 1 US Navy ship had been slightly damaged. Privately, the impending loss of the Marianas caused a crisis within the Japanese government. Desperate to salvage anything from the situation, prominent naval officers proposed a rescue plan, where the Navy would launch another sortie against the American fleet in the Marianas. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo rejected the plan as utterly infeasible, and argued that it would lead to a needless waste of lives. However, the rescue plan was favoured by Emperor Hirohito, and, following the fall of Saipan, Prime Minister Tojo was forced to resign on the 18th of July and replaced by General Kuniaki Koiso. Tojo's dismissal heralded a reshuffling of the Japanese government. Minister of the Navy Shigetaro Shimada was replaced by Mitsumasa Yone, while Prime Minister Koiso would now preside over the Supreme Council for the direction of the war. The idea behind the War Council was to better coordinate Japan's military campaigns and take back control over the Imperial General Headquarters, which had previously been dominated by Tojo. Young hardline officers from both the Navy and the Army were added to the council in an attempt to get rid of what was considered defeatism. At a meeting of the War Council on the 26th of July, Emperor Hirohito refused to leave Tokyo for the safety of the countryside. He declared, "I must remain on the mainland by all means, to try desperately to protect the mainland, where our grand shrine reigns." Far from contemplating defeat, Japan was committed to fighting on. The Navy would be key to stopping the Allied advance. The Commander-in-Chief of the Navy at this time was Admiral Toyoda. Toyoda was an unconventional choice for the job. He had no combat experience fighting against the Allies, and had been 10th in seniority before the Pacific War. However, he proved to be an energetic and clear-eyed leader. Upon being named Commander-in-Chief, Toyoda executed Admiral Koga's plans for the disastrous Battle of the Philippine Sea, which nearly resulted in the total destruction of the Mobile fleet. Following the battle, Toyoda and the Japanese naval staff spent the next 2 months working out how best to utilise the remainder of the Imperial Navy. They quickly found there was no solving this problem. Before the Battle of Leyte Gulf began, the Japanese Navy had lost 240 ships of all types in just the first 10 months of 1944 alone. By comparison, the Allied powers combined lost 50 ships in the Pacific, none larger than an escort carrier. The Allies could absorb these losses, while the Japanese had no such luxury. A major consequence of the new strategic bombing campaign against Japan was not just damage to industry, but transportation as well. In the first quarter of 1944, Japanese steel production stood at just over 1.4 billion metric tons. By the end of the year, this number had reduced to less than 800 million. Chairman of the Japanese Steel Company, Taijiro Toyoda, credited this drop-off to a 75% reduction in transportation facilities, which had been bombed by the Allies. As a result, shipbuilding became an increasingly difficult task at the worst possible time. The Imperial Navy had been devastated by almost 3 full years of attrition, and ships of all kinds were now in short supply, the most important of which being carriers. In response, 6 more were under construction by October 1944, half of which had been hurriedly converted from battleships into carriers. However, construction of capital ships was halted between November 1943 and November of 1944 due to the growing steel crisis. Regardless, these new aircraft carriers would be useless against the US Navy unless their air wings were combat effective. Naval aviation had suffered greatly at the Philippine Sea, but the following 3 months were just as bad. From July to September of 1944, the Navy lost 1,975 aircraft, including 773 in September alone. Aircraft production had increased at this stage in the war to cover these losses, no thanks to the Navy, which had made the critical error of not calculating the raw material required for programmed aircraft production prior to 1942. In 1943, Japanese industrial planners corrected this mistake and allocated 5.5 metric tons of aluminium per aircraft, but soon found that not enough aluminium was being shipped to Japan. At the time of Leyte Gulf, Japanese aircraft were built using only 2.4 tons of aluminium. The rest of the airframe was filled out by light steel, which placed even more strain on the steel industry. Ultimately, aircraft production mattered little when Japanese pilot training had fallen off a cliff. In 1940, aircrews were expected to have received over 500 hours of instructional flight training, a number which dwarfed the 400 hours demanded of American airmen. This rigorous training program produced one of the finest air forces in the world, demonstrated in Japan's early victories. By 1944, the situation had deteriorated. Most of the early war pilots were dead or combat ineffective, and skyrocketing losses had forced dramatic changes in Japanese aircrew training. In late 1944, Japanese pilots could expect little more than 80 hours of flight training, down from the 500 pre-war. Both the officer and enlisted programs were cut by 2 months, and age requirements were lowered to the point where 14-year-olds could legally fly for the Japanese Navy. Perhaps worst of all was the dire fuel situation in Japan. Prior to the Philippine Sea, Commander-in-Chief Toyoda fought a nasty bureaucratic battle against the Japanese government officials just to obtain the 80,000 tons of fuel needed to support the fleet in this single campaign. Much of this supply was then lost during the battle, which forced the Japanese Navy to anchor in the southern resource area around the Dutch East Indies. While this ensured the fleet would be adequately supplied with fuel, the rest of the empire was at the mercy of Allied submarines which attacked vulnerable supply lines. This meant that little fuel could reach the home islands themselves, which forced a further reduction in flight training. In many ways, the demise of the Japanese naval aviation mirrors that of its ally, the German Luftwaffe. Both air forces were elite early in the war, but a combination of attrition, fuel shortages, and poor pilot training doomed both to defeat by 1944. Aware of the immense challenges facing him, Toyoda's first objective was to determine where the next blow would come from and prepare an appropriate response. The Japanese Naval High Command drafted 4 Shogo or victory operations with separate contingency plans depending on where the Allies attacked next. Sho 1 was the designated plan for the defense of the Philippines, which is where the Japanese ultimately believed the next major offensive would be. The Philippines made the most sense for an Allied attack because its loss would cut Japan off from the southern resource area, which provided most of the empire's raw materials. With this in mind, the Japanese War Council decided to commit 70% of Japan's military resources to the coming battle, while saving the rest for a potential struggle for the mainland. Admiral Toyoda agreed with the plan, even though he and the rest of the Naval High Command knew it would likely mean the end of the Imperial Navy. However, Toyoda was acutely aware of the fate of Imperial Germany's navy during the First World War. Although the German surface fleet had enough firepower to damage the larger Royal Navy, Germany's military leadership did not want to risk losing the fleet in a major battle. Outside of the engagement at Jutland, the pride of Germany's navy wasted away in port until the war's end in 1918. Toyoda was determined to avoid the same indignity and decided to commit everything he had left. He believed that if the Philippines fell and the navy could no longer get adequate supplies of fuel, that it would be done for regardless. Better to strike now while the fleet still had some strength. Toyoda overhauled much of the Imperial Navy in preparation for this climactic battle. One of his most important actions was moving fleet headquarters off the light cruiser Oyodo and into the shore complex near Tokyo. This move was undoubtedly the right one. No flagship could support the hundreds of staff officers, including the 600 radiomen needed to communicate with the fleet as a whole. Furthermore, this meant that Toyoda could assess ongoing operations without being in the middle of combat. This long overdue move finally gave the Japanese Navy a modern naval headquarters. The next step would be getting the Navy back into fighting condition. For one, the fleet would need to be significantly upgunned, especially with anti-aircraft defense, now that Japanese aircraft could no longer be counted on to cover the surface fleet. By the end of the program, the fleet upgrade included the installation of more than 1,650 5-inch rocket launchers, 20 dual-purpose 5-inch powered gun mounts, nearly 2,000 25mm anti-aircraft guns, and more than 200 13mm flak pieces. Radar was also added to major warships to improve gunnery, another long overdue change. Japanese sailors were delighted with this upgrade, especially since the Imperial Navy's reputation as a fearsome night-fighting force had slipped in 1944. Yet, Vice Admiral Ugaki Matome, the leader of Battleship Division 1, believed that radar guidance would never be accurate enough to hit the enemy. He argued, to depend entirely and blindly on radar control should be limited to cases where no other means are available. During the intense training exercises prior to Leyte Gulf, Ugaki's battleships practiced mostly without radar, which rendered their addition pointless. Despite Ugaki's intransigence, the Japanese surface fleet made great strides in the months before the Philippines operation. At the anchorage of Lingga Roads off the island of Sumatra, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's second fleet trained non-stop from mid-July onwards. Kurita would later estimate that his fleet crammed a year's worth of exercises into these precious months, as the fleet practiced gunnery, damage control practices, tactics, and anti-submarine warfare. At this time, the Japanese Navy Ministry decided that officers would fight harder if they were promoted. These newly promoted officers would continue to bring their crews up to acceptable standards in the little time they had left. A major question remained: what was to be done about the wounded naval aviation arm of the fleet? Multiple air fleets had been destroyed during 1944 and would need time to reconstitute, but the Japanese pilot training program was failing new recruits. To underline the problem, Vice Admiral Kira Shunichi's staff released a study which showed that of the 500 pilots and crews in the 3rd Air Fleet, only 77 pilots were deemed fully capable, while 58 others were rated as capable for daytime missions only. All the rest were evaluated as insufficiently trained. A Mobile Fleet report issued on the 10th of September revealed that pilots would only be ready for daytime carrier landings by mid-October, an unacceptable prospect. The original Show 1 plan called for the Mobile Fleet's remaining aircraft carriers to conduct raids deep into the Allied rear areas, but war games showed this would not have an impact on the battle. Instead, the solution came from a combination of pragmatism and strategy. The famous aviator Mitsuo Fuchida, who helped plan the attack on Pearl Harbor, suggested that in the coming battle, the aircraft carriers should act as decoys. Mobile Fleet Commander Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa loved Fushida's recommendation and presented it to Commander-in-Chief Toyoda. Admiral Toyoda approved, and it was decided that the aircraft carriers would not play their usual role as the main striking force. The carrier aircrews would be stripped down to a skeleton crew. This would prevent another mass sacrifice of carrier pilots like at the Philippine Sea. The Japanese would instead rely upon the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service to bear the brunt of aerial combat during the battle. Any aircraft which flew off the carriers were expected to land at one of the air bases in the Philippines, because the Japanese High Command did not trust its pilots to land their aircraft back on the carriers. Rather, The aircraft were loaded onto the carriers before departure and assembled while the ships were in transit. Finally, there was the issue of Japanese naval doctrine. Should the Navy continue to seek out the enemy and engage them in the fabled decisive battle? Admiral Toyoda and his subordinates believed in the doctrine of decisive battle, but disagreed on its application in the Show 1 operation. Toyoda had seen how going after the Americans' powerful fast carrier forces had only led to disaster, and suggested the target of Show 1 should not be the enemy warships, but the troop transports and supply ships involved in the invasion of Leyte. This plan was also a better use of the decoy carriers, which were thought to be a credible enough threat to draw off the American Third Fleet. On the other hand, some naval officers were dumbfounded that Toyoda's plan was not predicated on doing battle with the enemy's strongest warships. Vice Admirals Kurita and Ugaki objected to the idea of targeting measly transport ships with their superior battleships. They did not believe this was in the spirit of the decisive battle. Ugaki instead offered his own plan of whittling down the enemy by launching 1 or 2 ship attacks deep into the Allied rear areas, an idea regarded as madness by Admiral Toyoda. Ultimately, Vice Admiral Kurita was won over by the argument that it was better to commit the entire fleet to one battle rather than suffer through months of attrition. The war is in its last stages, Kurita declared to his subordinates. Imperial headquarters has decided that the Navy is not strong enough to fight a decisive battle with the enemy. That is why, as a last resort, they have opted for a surprise attack. Once the order has been given, all we can do is proceed as planned. Yet, typical to the Japanese experience in the Second World War, Admiral Toyoda would later issue orders for Show 1 emphasizing the need to win a decisive battle, which only confused his officers in the field and would have dire consequences for the battle. The stage had been set for the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The following battle was to be the last stand of the Japanese Navy during the Pacific War. In his book Storm over Leyte, historian John Prados summed up the last months of the Imperial Navy's heyday. There is a certain logic that becomes apparent once the Japanese reached decisions. Even though their goals might be unobtainable, the Navy plotted reasonable directions toward them. The most the Japanese could hope for was a miracle.